Folks, it is the Q&A. We are back. Dr. James, Dr. Mike here to answer your questions from the YouTube. Dr. Mike, how's it going?
It was a really sensual introduction. I almost feel like you're hosting like some kind of like midnight hour love podcast with that introduction.
Do you remember Dr. Drew? Before he got into like celebrity rehab and all that stuff, when people were like, my penis is bent and it hurts my girlfriend. What do I do?
Dude, this one girl called in when I was like 12 years old when I heard this. She called in and she was like, every time I pee, I have an orgasm and I think I'm going to die. And Dr. Drew's like, you're definitely not going to die. I mean, maybe you get hit by a fucking car or something. You're not going to die from this. And then it was him and who was it? Him and Adam Carolla.
Was it Adam Carolla? Yeah.
And Adam's like, that's the greatest. Why the fuck are you calling us? That's the greatest thing that's ever happened to you. You shut up about it. Don't tell anyone. Like, just enjoy all your orgasms.
That was a great mismatch in like personality types for that show. It just worked so well.
Yeah. And of course, like Dr. Drew's like, well, now don't, there could be something wrong. And I understand how it would be unpleasant to have an orgasm 8 times a day or whatever. So, and in public all the time, but like, here's what you can do and who you can follow up with. And here's what it might be. But it was funny. Adam Carolla was like, that's not a problem. That's the greatest thing that's ever happened anyway.
Drink
like,
more water, orgasm more.
Good God. All right. I have lists of names and they have questions.
Fantastic. I got it pulled up. Let's do this.
Excellent. All right. So, Rikimaru the Hulk is first. And he says, I have a 2-part question about unavoidable use of a muscle when it's not recovered. For context, I have a manual labor job that involves lots of picking up, holding, and carrying, very taxing on all the pull muscles. I train back and biceps at the end of the week so I can recover from that workout during my days off on the weekend. But since I want to train those groups more than once a week, any earlier sessions are inevitably followed by days at work where I'm using my sore muscles. My questions are, how detrimental is this? Am I merely missing out on the better gains that proper rest and recovery would provide, or something more negative happening? My assessment is nothing more negative is happening, other than the fact that it's just extra added fatigue means you won't either be able to stimulate as well or recover as well. But the as well, maybe like 15% difference on both. So you get 85% of the gains you could have, which is to say most of them. Like, for example, 85% gains means if, over a year, someone gains 10 pounds of muscle, you gain 8.5. Like, you can barely tell the difference. Both guys look like they gained almost the same amount of muscle. So that's my assessment there. And any advice and suggestions do you have for those of us in situations like this? Thanks for everything. Sincerely. My suggestion, James is going to have a lot of good stuff here. I think the fact that you're training back at the end of the week and letting it recover through the weekend is probably pretty swell. I would also maybe do something where if you don't want to feel sore all the time, you can train back a little less volume, a bit more frequently, and then you're not really disrupted much when your muscles are never really going to get very sore. It's going to lead to some similar hypertrophy and strength gains. You just have to train back a little bit more often. But I think if you train back just another time during the week, and you train it with very small amount of axial loading, because that can really catch up on a manual labor job, like, more chest supported rows and assisted pull-ups and pull-ups versus more bent rows and deadlifts kind of thing. And if you train it like that, it's just not going to work as well, but it should work just fine. And when you're sore and you're moving around at work and you're like, my back is sore, but I'm still using it. Remember that some amount of use of a muscle when it's sore actually leads to a faster recovery and more growth because it pushes blood through the muscle, et cetera. And also, if you're eating very well, another thing you can remember is that your manual labor job keeps you artificially way leaner than everybody else because your energy output is so insane that if you just tighten up your diet for a few weeks, a lot of times you can lose the kind of fat with basically almost no fatigue cost that other people would consider as like insane. And so your downside is you will never have, so long as you have this job, I can tell you right now, you'll never have the kind of back and biceps that you want relative to what you're able to get genetically. It'll just never happen. However, you will be significantly leaner and cooler looking than if you had a job where you just sat around all the time. So I would say that maybe is something to focus on to see the situation from it's not that bad kind of light. It's kind of like someone has to move to modern Mexico for 3 months. And they're like, oh, Mexico, it's a third world country. Like, not anymore, man. They have internet and grocery stores and everything's great. So yeah, it's not like living like in Sweden. You would live a little better. The crime rate would be lower, et cetera. but Mexico's still great. It's like it's 85% of Sweden, so to speak. So it's not like you're getting moved to North Korea. So that's how I would say the analogy works here. James, what do you think?
Yeah, and just to kind of go in a slightly different direction than Dr. Mike, the good news too is that given that this is what you do day in and day out, your muscles develop a work capacity for this type of daily work, right? So that being said, you could actually train your back and biceps relatively normally, like 2 to 3 times per week, depending on how you recover normally. And then you would just be a little bit more sore all the time. But if that's not a huge deal if you don't mind. So like if you want to train your back and biceps more and don't mind just being like kind of sore at work, that's perfectly fine. So that's your call. If you don't want to be sore all the time, then I think Dr. Mike's recommendations of maybe either training more frequently or just kind of understanding that you won't be as big in those areas as you possibly could is perfectly fine. But so if I was in your shoes, I would use the exact same performance and fatigue indicators that we do for everything else. And just know that you won't be able to push your back and biceps quite as hard as some of your other muscle groups. And you are going to be, a little bit more sore in those areas more often than not, just because of your manual labor. So those things will auto-regulate themselves out where because you have to do so much manual labor, you just won't be able to put in as much effort on back and biceps. Let's say if you were training 2 to 3 times per week, and that would show up in the normal performance indicators and you would auto-regulate accordingly. So I think either one is fine. It kind of depends on whether or not you want to feel sore all the time or if you want to just be slightly bigger. So it's your call.
Next up is Giannis Bravado.
Oh boy.
Goddamn. Anyway, Perswara. He says, hey docs, how far can you get with only or mostly leg extensions for quad development if you do a lot of volume and intensity techniques on that exercise? So I have a couple of good answers to this. One, it depends a lot on how good the raw stimulus magnitude is for leg extensions for you and your build and your muscles. Like for myself or for Jared Feather, a lot of times leg extensions are like, oh, gee, this isn't really that stimulative. For other folks, James particularly, leg extensions really fuck him up. So James' answer to this question for himself would be much better than my answers the question for myself for Jared. Another consideration is you can actually get really good quad development. I would say maybe 80 to 90% of your best quad development can occur exclusively from using leg extensions and in various very creative programming periodization schemes so as to not make them stale. I think it can be done. However, the problem is that a lot of what you consider your leg mass, even if you take hamstrings and glutes out, leg extensions just don't hit that well. One of the things, if you look at like a picture of a bodybuilder, this is one of those illusions that occurs in a couple of different areas in the body. There is a substitution for muscles by explicit smaller muscle groups, and the substitution presupposes that it takes care of all of the muscle in that area. That's not true. So for example, your quads, people say, oh yeah, that's the other part of your leg other than hamstrings and glutes. Like, that's right. That's what the volume landmarks say. We don't have an adductor section and how to train on any of our videos. The thing is, when you're training your quads through normal compound leg exercises, lunges, squats, hack squats, leg presses, your adductors take a huge amount of stress and stimulus and grow a ton. They're also enormous muscles that grow a lot. Also, if you look visually at almost any of your favorite pro bodybuilders, their adductors are enormous and sometimes bigger by volume seemingly than the quads. And sometimes the quad itself, if you outline that muscle in like a picture, you're like, oh, what the fuck is all this other shit? Like, that's a fucking adductor. Like Big Rami's got big quads. He's got big adductors too. And that's like damn near half his leg as viewed from many angles. That would be almost completely untrained. And so you would have like pretty cool quads, like they could be feathered and pretty raised, but people would be like, your legs are kind of skinny looking, literally from the front. They would appear thinner because your quads would be cool, but your adductors would be fucking shit out of luck. A similar thing, James, I wonder if this gets to you as much as to me, when people reflexively use lats and back, like you look at a picture, it's awful. You look at a picture of Brandon Curry's back, one of the best backs there is. His lats are like maybe a third of the total surface area, maybe less. And his spinal erectors and his mid traps are fucking enormous, and his rhomboids are huge. And it's like, oh wow, the lats are just an addition to the back in this case. So just the same way as if you said, hey, can I get my biggest back ever doing the direct analogy to this question is, can I get a huge back doing lat prayers, right? No, you could get pretty good lats, not your best lats, but really impressive lats. But the rest of your back would look skinny. Your traps would look like shit. Your erectors, you just got like you could have a wide back, but a thin back. and you know,
I was just trying to
famously for
imagine in
leg
my mind
extensions.
how that would look. That would look very
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah, it's like the difference between an Olympia competitor's back and a men's physique guy's back. Men's physique guys can boom, they pump. They sort of push their shoulders out and their lats look wide, but then from the side and from the back, you're like, dude, you're not that big, are you? You're like, no, it all just looks big when I stand in a certain spot. So same for quads. Yeah, your quads could get hit pretty well, but the rest of your overall leg mass, gee whiz, you know, not ideal.
Yeah, really great answer there. And just keep in mind too, like the leg extensions, like there is regional specific hypertrophy for certain movements, and the leg extensions really only hit kind of that like bottom third of the quad, kind of in that teardrop area mostly. Some people can eke a little bit more out of it, like myself, but it's really hitting a very small area compared to something like a squat, which hits a huge portion of the quads. And as Mike already described, a whole lot of other muscles as well. You can get a lot out of like increasing volume and intensity for a couple mesos. You can even squeak out a few more mesos of like switching up your rep ranges a little bit. And you can maybe even squeak out a few more by using things like myo reps or metabolite protocols. Like you can milk that knee extension pretty far. The problem is that the regional specific fibers that it hits, the amount of stretch, the amount of tension that you can actually generate on that particular movement just has its limits. So I'm just noticing some of the people kind of had commented below that they are kind of pondering the same issue because of chronic back pain, which is a valid concern. And in that case, like I think some combination of things like knee extensions, or you could even explore the world of like sissy squats. I know that's hit or miss for a lot of people, and maybe you might have to work up to it because it does put so much stress on the knee joint itself. But I think even that would be a slightly better alternative to just doing knee extensions. I don't know if you guys follow Derek Wilcox. He's one of our RP coaches. I saw him doing a really interesting Smith machine sissy squat variation the other day, which for those of you who struggle with kind of the awkwardness of the sissy squat might be a good one. They also make a little sissy squat machine. I have one of those in my house where you just lock your feet in and kind of sit back into it. That's also another good alternative with a lot less spinal loading. So I would say explore some of those options before you just say knee extension for life.
And then supersetting the knee extensions to bodyweight squats, to sissy squats, and to walking lunges or even in place lunges is maybe a swell idea to add even more variation and also check the boxes a little bit more than you normally would on your adductors.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Next up is Rainbug. Boig. He asks, or she, hey, docs.
A mustachioed man, so I'm going to assume
that's but also, is that really Rainbug? Unlikely. It's probably like, you know, if we're this is awful. I don't mean this, Rainbug. This is just a joke. But like, I just kind of sometimes assume that YouTube is composed entirely of like proto-fascist incels. And this guy's like, well, yeah, actually, this is like the philosopher who had a lot of great ideas about fascism before, like Hitler fucked them up. And I'm just saying, like, it's good to read because maybe like our own society could be improved by having more fascism, or something like that. So
there are so many people like that.
It's especially on the internet. Yeah. If people think there could ever be like a fascist revolution, I'm like, I don't know, man. I think like 60% of all people think those are swell ideas. That's not good.
There's like a subset of people who use that same thing, and you can apply any number of different topics where it's like, that's not really what fascism is. Have you read so and so? That's really not what communism is all about, or socialism, or Marxism. Have you read blah blah blah? And it's like, shut up.
Well, how does it end? Oh, like shit every time. That's not good. Let's not do that.
Yeah.
All right. Rainbug asks, hey docs, what are your thoughts on combining studying for a master's in kinesiology and simultaneously training hard and also coaching? Did you have any trouble in your school days with combining these three aspects? And do you have any tips on what to focus on and how to still adhere to a good diet and still keep progressing in all three? Thanks for the help. Yeah, no problem. So the first thing is like, you have to find out, it's much less of can you do all three of these at the same time? And it's much more of a question of how much of all three can you do at the same time. So like, you're studying for the master's is one block of time that you use per week. That's just not really alterable. Like, because we assume you want to do a good job. It's going to.
There's an MRV analogy coming in here sooner or later, guys. Be prepared.
Yeah, sooner or later. So then you have like just some amount of time left in the week, and remember you have to block off. And so far we've got let's say three blocks of time. general shit you do any day, like brush your teeth and jack off, like you have to have time for that. Okay. Then there's time to go to school and do your homework and do the master's thing. That's another block of time. Another block of time you want to save is at least a few hours every day of just relaxation. And definitely most of your weekends should be free to just relax. So you can, it's not so you can have a great time in life. It's so you can, that also is a result. But it's really so you can refresh to continue that process for 2 or 3 years while you do a master's. If you just grind and work all the time, you're just going to burn out very likely, and it's not going to be good. So now we have all those things outlined. You're going to have a certain amount of time left over. And based on how long it takes you to do all those things and how much relaxation you think you need to see, okay, how much time do I have for hard training and also coaching? And for you, hard training may be something that is, again, set in stone. Like for James and I, it always was. We never didn't train during our entire educational career. That was always like that, staying, and it's full bore, hard as ever. So for us, that there was another blocks in there that was blocked in. And then James and I would look at what we had left and say, okay, well, I have time for 10 clients a week on average, or I have time for 20 clients or 5 clients or 0 clients. So that's how I'd go about that, is block off all the shit you have, see how many hours you have of actually free time to commit to something like coaching after you've blocked in your training and everything else. And if for you're one of these people, because James and I could say, well, yeah, to us it was fine because we would go to school, we would study for roughly an hour a week outside of school or something, because we had no problem understanding what was going on at school. We were already pretty close to being experts in that. And then so for us, school was sitting in class and just confirming ideas versus like especially in our PhD programs, James and I didn't go home and like study the textbook for hours and baffle what the fuck is going on. Like, oh no, I need to do more word problems. It wasn't that conventional kind of organic chemistry studying. So for us, we'd have plenty of time to do other shit because like to us, school was pretty easy at that point in our career, not always. But for you might be in a situation where like, oh, a master's in kinesics, I tried to do the whole bullshit. It didn't work. I need to spend like 4 hours a day studying and reviewing concepts, or 3 hours a day. Well, then for you, the answer would be like, oh, maybe you can have 5 clients, or maybe you can have 0 clients. Whereas for us, the answer was like 20 clients or something. So that's how I best look at it, is block off everything that has to get done, give it a very charitable amount of time for each thing. Just, you don't want to be like, oh, I only need half an hour a day for this, and it turns out it's an hour and a half. Be very charitable. And then if you have some stuff left, you figure out, okay, am I really going to do what I have to do? And then the answer is yes, and you go to it. Or the answer is, well, geez, it really is not enough time for me. And then maybe I won't try to burn all the bridges at the same time. James?
Yeah, that was really good. I think the coaching is the tough one because it depends on how you're coaching. Like if you're just doing private sector stuff, like if you're just doing clients online, then it's kind of like you have a lot of flexibility to do whatever you want. If you're doing like what Mike and I did, where we were working as strength and conditioning coaches, like that is heavily dependent on the athlete's training schedule. So you might feel like, oh, I want to train with these athletes all the time, but it's like, okay, well, they only train at the times when you're otherwise in class. So then it's like, okay, well, now you're kind of fucked. Mm-hmm. So that one's the one that is kind of the wild card. For Mike and I, like I can speak for myself more specifically, I was fortunate that, I mean, like when we were there getting our education, I just threw myself into that world as far as I could go. I mean, I started the men's rugby team. I was the assistant coach, sport coach, and the strength conditioning coach for that. I worked with the golf team. I worked with the tennis team. I would help out every now and again with like the weightlifters. I would help out with all the testing that we did in the lab. Like I was just all in, and it definitely wreaked havoc on my personal life. Like I had to give up all of the other hobbies that I enjoyed doing. I used to love to play guitar. I used to love to go snowboarding. I love to shoot. I like to do a lot of other things. And for about 3 years, I had to give up pretty much all of the other things in my life that made me happy because I wanted to just submerge myself in this world. It's kind of similar like with learning a language, right? Where you can do like Duolingo, or you can do some of these practice things, but the best way to learn if you want to like speak Spanish or Thai or something is just to like go out there and live in that world. And so that's what I did, and that's not the course that everyone can do. I was fortunate that I was able to do that. So you might find that studying for your master's and learning how to train hard and smart is a huge bang for your buck. Whereas like the coaching is like you really have to force it to make it happen because it's really inconvenient, or it just doesn't fit your schedule, or you're just running out of time. So like Mike said, I would say pick the things that are probably the most important to you. And to me, that seems like your education, learning how to train and do it in a smart way, and then see how much time left over you have for your own personal life, your hobbies, your relationships, and the amount of coaching you can do after that. Because coaching, it's one thing to show up as a coach and just show up and go through the X's and O's of whatever you're doing that day. It's another thing to actually be like, I think, a really good coach where you develop really good bonds with your athletes. You have really good interpersonal relationships. They trust you. You're invested in their well-being. You're invested in their lives. There's different levels of coaching, right? And sometimes you just need to show up and say, hey, we're doing 5x5s today. I'm going to walk you through it. And sometimes you need to be a surrogate father to some of these people. There's not a right or wrong answer there. It's just different levels of involvement that you have to decide what you're going to do.
Yeah, that's the lock. Youth Cruise is up next.
I don't like that name. I don't know why. It's lame. Like, am I going on a cruise full of youths? That's the last thing I want. Get the fuck out of here. Right. Dumbass kids.
God damn it. So Youth Cruise says, hey there, docs. I have long arms and I've been struggling to add size to my triceps. Closer to the shoulder, it feels / looks like tons of tricep meat, then closer to the elbow, my arms thin out. I use full ranges of motion and always experience soreness after heavy push days or high volume days. Is this simply a muscle insertion issue that my triceps don't connect all the way down to my elbows? Well, so they do. It's just that a lot of it ends up being very thin muscle and or tendon. I say 90% of the right answer here is that, yes, your arms are going to be shaped largely the same way. You see this in some guys that have this kind of genetics, but they take a crap. Not I'm saying you should take a crap ton of gear. I actually would be saying the opposite. I know guys who've had this sort of thin arm genetics and take a ton of gear. James, it's a lot of times like white dudes that are tall and have big ass shoulders, big ass chest, big back, right? There you go. And then like, well, James, you're not even an extreme version of that, but like their triceps and biceps, they're proximally oriented in their muscle distribution. So everything's very proximal. Distal is just not a lot going on. Whereas like I've trained a few folks. So one of them is an IFBB pro physique lady that we trained on the channel. She is like basically considered, what was it? Her nickname is the Cuban muscle crisis.
That's a sweet name.
Yeah, it's a sweet name. But she has the most distally oriented muscle insertions and origins I've ever seen, where like her calves are like hanging off of her, and her triceps, like she just sits there and her triceps hang. And if she does this, her triceps bulge out at the bottom. There's nothing up here.
So weird.
So it's just like unreal bubble muscle, which gives her, for however much she weighs, which isn't a lot, she looks 10 times more muscular just because she has that pop. A lot of people don't have that pop, and Youth Cruise, you might be at the extreme of that. Is there a way to find out? Is there a way that full range of motion, especially at the extreme end just here, actually hypertrophies more of the distal end? Yes, that's already true. But you say you train full ROM already. That's probably your biggest weapon. Can you train more of the long head if you find out the long head's the small part? Yes, but again, that only changes so much at the margins. I'll say that I used to train my long head and the triceps all the time with lots of overhead work. Became insufficiently flexible to do that very well as I got bigger. And also I was taking so much long head beating from my pulling work that I just stopped training, any overhead tricep extension stuff altogether multiple years ago. And I can't tell you my triceps have changed in shape since then. I wouldn't be able to say that and put money on it. Maybe subtly, but I can't even tell you which way that subtlety happened. So the shape is so genetic within a particular muscle group that even the regional differences of various ways of training amount to very little. And you're still probably going to be largely skinnier-ish arms, but the rest of you can get super fucking jacked. James?
Yeah, I feel you, my friend. I have this problem too. I only recently have my arms actually looked respectable for a fitness person. The problem when you have really long arms and legs is just there's a lot of surface area to fill out in order for you to look jacked. So if you don't have like really good Hafthor Bjornsson level muscle growth genetics, it's just going to always kind of look skinny, as Mike already said. And you could be actually making really good gains in size, but you actually just visually it doesn't look like it because you have a huge amount of space that muscle is filling out, right? So you could be actually putting on relatively good gains every year and really not visualize it as much. So that is one of the problems that you run into, and that's just kind of the luck of the draw, unfortunately. If your tricep training is otherwise going good, keep doing what you're doing, and it's just going to take a long time for you to really see visual changes in your arms. If your tricep training is not going so good, consider using something like myo-reps. That's one thing that I have found to be really helpful in my arm training, whereas before it would just seem like, okay, I'm training triceps today. I have to do like 10 fucking sets to get like any soreness, any pump or anything going on. And then what I found was when I switched over to myo reps, I was able to get a lot more stimulus, a lot bigger bang for my buck per set, especially on the arms, which has always been a tough area for me specifically. And it seems to be reaping some good dividends at this point. So give that a try if you're struggling on tricep training. If your tricep training is otherwise good, keep doing what you're doing.
Great advice. Sean Patton is up next. And Sean asks, he says, greetings, gentlemen. I'm 4 weeks into a cut. This week, I've broken a glass and a plate and I'm feeling clumsy. I'm typically not a clumsy person.
This is a great question.
Is a degradation of coordination something you've seen people when cutting or overtraining? Thanks for the awesome podcast. So first of all, in cutting, it's unlikely, but it can happen when you have lower blood glucose. You typically would be aware of the fact that you did. You'd get very hungry, you fantasize about sugary things, and start sweating and stuff like that. Then you would also be clumsy. So that could be minor hypoglycemia, could be leading you clumsy. 4 weeks into a cut, I don't suspect you're in that range. So I'd say it's low probability. Can overreaching degrade your athleticism and increase your clumsiness? Absolutely. It absolutely can. But that wouldn't have much to do with cutting and have more to do with training volume. Now, of course, if you're doing high training volume while cutting, you can overreach harder. So I don't think it's something. So it says, is degradation of coordination something you've seen from people when cutting? Typically, no, not in any major way. When overtraining, yes, but it's such a small thing that I guess you start to remember it. And then when you're in your last week of training and you're feeling uncoordinated in the gym, you kind of assume you're also not so coordinated in real life, and you don't try to do anything super athletic like the bartender cup toss trick. You just stay away from, a little bit more careful. And I think that's it. It's not a major thing, but I'd say at the margins, yeah, that can be something to pick up on. James?
Yeah. So something that Jacob and I observed when we were working together at ETSU was that very often when athletes are really fatigued for a variety of reasons, whether it's just training hard or dieting, you would think that they're kind of like looking clumsy, but through a slightly more careful observation, one of the things that we kind of concluded was that their ability to make good decisions and their ability to focus their attention under fatigued conditions was very often the underlying cause of stupid choices, right? Like, so very often the athletes would be like really fatigued, either because we were dieting them or they were in a really hard training block. And you would see them do things in volleyball, for example, that would otherwise be a bad call. And then they would roll their ankle or something and be like, right. Not a huge deal. But I think more often than not, especially when you factor in like diet fatigue, it's more that you're just not as sharp. Your attention's not as good, and maybe you're just doing kind of dumb things that you would not otherwise do, and it kind of comes off as being clumsy and uncoordinated, but really it's like just up here, like you're reaching for something without thinking about it, without looking, or you're just not paying attention to what you're doing as much. So that's just an observation that I have made with some of my colleagues, where very often when people are fatigued, they just start making kind of dumb or less calculated choices in what they're doing. They're just not paying attention. And that often leads to instances like this, where you're just kind of, it seems like you're being clumsy or you're breaking stuff or you seem like a doofus. And really it's just because you're mentally not there. And some of that's hypoglycemia, some of that's just like systemic fatigue, some combination of all those things.
Good luck, John. Don't do anything crazy like jumping into a wood chipper.
Oh God, I'm thinking about buying a wood chipper actually.
Good God, that's disturbing.
So I can get rid of all the bodies.
Yeah. Ian Brown says, hi, James and Mike. I feel like my deload recovery isn't going together like I expect it to, but I can't tell if I'm overdosing or underdosing my deload plan. Is there a maximum RIR between which the set is too easy to be worthwhile deload set? Should a lifter judge this question in terms of percent of Rome reps instead of RIR? So first thing is there is a possibility that your deload is too easy. A lot of times it happens for very slower twitch muscles you have that have a very fast turnover rate. And if they're not adequately stimulated relatively heavy pretty often, they actually involute quite rapidly. I've seen this happen with athletes I've been coaching. Like one of my friends who I used to coach and do every now and again still, he was a power lifter, and we would have to keep heavy flat flies into his program as close to a week before his meet, because if we removed them, his pecs would shrink and his bench would go down. His pecs were always, his pecs were always smaller than the rest of his body. They were really big, but the rest of him was fucking enormous. And he struggled to put on pec size, and the pecs would never overtrain, never overreach. They barely ever got sore. they just needed a lot of stimulus because their turnover was really high. That may be the case, and then your deload needs to be harder. But the way you're saying is, my deload recovery isn't coming together like I expect it to. If you're actually getting weaker during the deload, so here's how you would feel if this thing was happening to you that I just described. You would feel very quickly recovered during a deload. You would feel great. You would get to the gym on the next week, beginning of accumulation. And even though you felt great, the weights would be really heavy. And you're like, what the fuck? Like, I feel recovered. My sleep is great. Everything feels, I fucking literally lost muscle size. What the fuck? That's how it would feel. You would feel super fucking recovered because you would be. If you actually don't feel recovered, that's probably much more of a situation of you're not eating enough consistently, you're not sleeping enough consistently, you're not low stress enough during your deload. And if we had to err, and this is to directly answer your question, and somebody already did, bear in a bag, that's a funny name, actually already answered it quite well. It's kind of impossible from a recovery perspective to underdo the deload. Like, easier is almost always better, up to a really insane point of doing nothing. Like, if some people that are ultra fast twitch and ultra have problems with recovery, you can just tell them, hey, look, do some bodyweight squats and push-ups midway through this week, 3 sets of 5 of each and some pulls, and you're good. That's all I want you to do. And for them, a lot of times that works even better than an intricate deload where they're asked to work harder. So in your case, unless you have that situation happening like I described, like you recover great and then you show up weaker, in which case more is better. Your case is probably less is better, if anything. Or, and I have to say this, it might not be anything to do with your deload programming. It could be to do with your fatigue reduction. You could be spending your deload worried like shit about projects at work. You could spend it sleeping, so not so great. You could spend it eating, not so great. At the end of the day, all that stuff can make your deload work so poorly that you end up looking and being like, what am I doing wrong in the weight room? And the answer could be like, well, actually, you're doing nothing wrong. And there's also nothing you could do right in the weight room. This is a question, real quick, side tangent. James and I used to get a lot. And it was one of these things where we had to answer this question from a holistic perspective based on theory. So we had to write a few books before we could answer the question super well. The question is something like, okay, if my sleep is really shitty or my diet is really shitty, what can I do in my training to make up for it? And the fundamental answer to the question is nothing. Nothing. These things are complementary in a way that you can't just replace them with some kind of more intricate training. Like people actually say, like, remember Jason used to ask the questions? Right. Yeah, exactly. People would say like, well, I can't get as much sleep as I want. How do I modify my program? And we're like, we can give you one modification.
Train less.
It's how to survive the week. Whether what about progression? We're like, well, you can forget about progression because that shit's out the fucking window. Basically, the minimum amount of stimulus it would take to have you progress is exceeding your MRV. So good luck. Right. So for you, I would say definitely think about all the other stuff you could be doing better on your deload. As far as training is concerned, unless you have that thing I described, you're probably in the case of where you're doing at least enough, and doing more probably is not the answer. James.
Really good answer. I was trying to think of some I'm trying to think of some other situations where you could find yourself in this, and I thought of two as Mike was talking. So one way that you could, this is quote unquote underdoing your deload. It's not really underdoing your deload so much as if your training in the weeks prior to deload was understimulative, and you deloaded, and essentially at that point you're just deconditioning, right? That can be a problem where you actually just you were basically doing like maybe MEV training or less during your mesocycle, and then you switch to deload and you're like, why do I feel weak? And that's because you've been understimulative for too long. That is a potential thing that can happen. Another thing that I'm imagining here in this situation is maybe you were very much overreached. Maybe you did very good, hard training, and you're on like day 2 of your deload, and you're thinking, my deload, I don't feel recovered yet. Well, it's like, it actually might take 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 days before you are feeling recovered, depending on how hard you trained. So if you're kind of in that boat where it's like day 2 or 3 and you're still feeling under recovered, you just have to give it some more time, and you might be somebody who needs to actually take a slightly longer than 1 week deload. Some people are like that. Maybe you got to take 10 days. That's totally fine.
I'm in the beginning of my active rest right now. My last hard training session was Sunday. Today's Wednesday. I haven't trained Monday or Tuesday. To be honest, my fatigue feels almost the same as at peak. It's just today's the first day in which I'm really starting to notice it's falling a little bit. What the fuck? Well, that's how active rest works. Like, it's gonna take me 2 weeks to get through all this. Maybe you're in that case as well.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be like fussing too much about like RIRs and stuff if you're generally doing, what I would say reasonable deload training, you're probably fine. It's fairly hard to fuck up a deload in these ways. Like the only way that you're really fucking it up is if you're doing MEV training or higher at 0 IR during your deload, right? It's like, okay, you've unticked the volume and intensity box on the deload. That's the only way you could have fucked it. So if you're not doing that, you're probably fine.
Next up is Sue Rowland. Sue Rowland asks, "Hi docs, I'm oldish, 62 years young, Sue. Relatively new, 5 years lifter. Quite in the intermediate range, I think James and I would say it.
Yeah.
Sue, you're not allowed to say you're new if you've done something for 5 years. Can you imagine like you're like in Afghanistan for 5 years and a new like recruit comes to join your division? You're like, I'm new here too, bro. It's been 5 years. What the fuck? Really? How long is it going to take? So, and then she says, I have a hard time differentiating joint pain / damage from tendon ligament pain from muscle growth and damage. Is there any way to tell the difference? Thank you. There are a couple ways, and none of them are foolproof. I'll have a few, and I'm sure James will have a few. One is there are some telltale signs of shit that really is for sure probably not muscle, and that's like when it's in the middle of your joint. So there's no muscles in here, right? So if that hurts and doing this hurts, and it's not the tricep tendon, it's not the bicep forearm flexor tendons, then like if it's in the middle of the joint here, like in between this here somewhere, it's joint pain. Same with the knees, same with the hips. If there's not a clear, obvious muscle or tendon structure next to it and it hurts, it's not joint. It's joint pain. It's not something else. As far as connective tissue, you can probably palpate where your muscle groups start and where the connective tissue is. So like right here for me, it's not triceps, it's all tricep tendon. Now right here is where the muscle starts. If I'm sore here, yeah, sure, my tendon is sore too. But if this doesn't hurt, but this hurts, then it's the muscle. Another point that branches right off there, generally speaking, the kind of muscle pain that's good, delayed onset soreness, things like that, they're typically in the belly of the muscle, the big middle meat of that stuff. Like here's where your biceps get sore. If your biceps are sore here, maybe it's your biceps, maybe it's your bicep tendon, maybe it's some other stuff. But if they get sore here, like it's your biceps for sure. So there's some middle ground of intersection because like, look, like right here, my bicep could be sore in the distal area. It could be the tendon. It could even be something in the elbow. It would take a little bit more discrimination to figure out. Another one real quick is you can try to figure out if it's stretch-based pain or force generation-based pain. This is how I actually derive the difference between injuries and just little bullshit that happens during recovery. So like my quads, I'll feel like a line through my quad that's like, oh my God, it's painful when I stretch it a lot. What the fuck? Did I rip my quad? And then what I do is I try to push my leg through the ground really hard, and it doesn't hurt at all. Well, true injuries, if there's a lot of force transduction through the muscle, they're going to fucking hurt. You don't have a quad tear, push really hard, knee extend, and it's like, well, I don't feel it. Like you'll feel it. So for me, I'm like, oh, it's just weird connective tissue crap, like on the outside sheath of the muscle that must be. Because if it's only hurting when you stretch it, but it doesn't hurt when you produce a ton of force in a non-stretch position, then it's totally fine. It's just some bullshit. So that's another way you could sort of derive of like, is there a serious thing here? But a lot of it's just like knowing anatomy decently well to know where's the pain. Is it in the joint or is it in the muscle belly? There is some gray area there. And another one. So here's an example. If you think the pain's in the joint, put your joint in some way that doesn't hurt and then flex the fuck out of or extend your tricep against resistance. If that doesn't hurt, then it wasn't a tricep tendon problem. Like if your tricep tendon hurts, it'll hurt in every single possible position because it transduces force every time. It'll hurt here, it'll hurt here, it'll hurt here. If your elbow is like, James, you ever get like some clicking in your elbow? It only hurts in this range of motion. Like if that's the case, and then you exit that range, you flex your biceps, nothing. Flex your biceps here, nothing. You flex them here, ow. It's the joint. It's not the bicep. Because if it was the bicep, every point at which the bicep was active, which is the entire range, would hurt. And if that's not the case, you can sort of process of elimination your way to saying, I think it's the knee joint versus a part of my muscle.
Yeah, really good explanation there. A couple other things too is joint and tendon pain tends to be very sharp and acute, right? Where you move around and it's like, yow, woo, that hurt. Whereas muscle pain is kind of like, oof. It's the classic is like when you've done lunges and then you try to sit down and you're like, oh, my buns, damn, right? Whereas that joint pain is like jarring. It's like that very sharp, acute pain when you do something. Another good differentiating factor too is like the joint and tendon pain tends to be kind of all the time at very, very low levels of movement. So walking around or reaching for, like, if you're wondering, like, are my shoulders sore, or is it like a joint thing? Like, if it's a joint thing, you'll feel it doing very mundane things like riding or reaching for something. Whereas, like, if your delts are just sore, it might take you to actually having to, like, do a big stretch or reach overhead. There's kind of like a threshold of motor activation before you kind of notice it as much. Whereas if it's a joint pain, it's like anything you do is like, ooh, ow, ow. Like with knees, another good example. Like if you have knee pain, that's as a result of something wrong with the joint from an injury, it hurts all the goddamn time just moving around and walking. Whereas like if your quads are sore, you might not really notice your quads are sore when you're walking around unless they're really sore. But when you sit down or you try to go up a stair or something, you're like, oh, my thighs, oh my God, they're a little sore. So those are some good like differentiating points too, in addition to what Mike said.
Yeah, very good point. All right, Veer Shah is up next.
Okay.
It's actually a very long question with a not so long answer. So Veer Shah says, hey docs, in the recent back workout videos posted on our RP YouTube channel, you have stated that doing isometric holds at the peak contraction for rows might be slightly less stimulative, as you'd be sacrificing some performance that could otherwise have been used, creating more tension in the stretched position, right? And James, just to clue you in, it's like, if you choose the barbell row to pause at the chest for 2 seconds every rep, you have to use like 185 pounds. For if you just do the same high quality reps but touch, it's 225. Right. And that stretch position is getting way less load, way less stimulus. You also spend more time at the top fatiguing yourself to get fewer reps that could have gone through the stretch position. It's more hypertrophic. So in any case, can this rationale be applied to other exercises as well, such as leg curls, lat prayers, chest flies? Yes. With a slightly more stimulative, avoiding isometric holds at a fully shortened position, yes, absolutely can be. Since also because length tension relationship, muscles are generally stronger in the mid-length and part of their natural contractile range. So you got to be careful here, because stronger doesn't mean to stimulate hypertrophy more. Muscles at a very extreme end range are not very strong, but their internal moment they generate is very high, and the amount of stimulus because the prepared stretch is insanely high. Sometimes they don't even generate very high EMGs there, but they get a crap ton of damage and they get a crap ton of growth as measured directly by studies. So that the whole business, I'll say this, of trying to maximize hypertrophy by trying to put muscles in their strongest positions is already antithetical to where muscles grow the most in many cases. Right. So we got to be careful about yes, it's good to avoid positions where the muscle is like almost completely inactive. Like if you straighten your arm completely and try to do a pec fly, at some point your chest is like, I'm not getting you hurt. I'm turning off if it's all the way down here. So if you bend it a little, it's like, okay, fine, we got some work going. But generally speaking, I would be careful about getting into the natural contractile range force production. If you're trying to get stronger athletes, yes, then the external force production is a good idea. Internally, a lot of different things are going on. Can't be so sure. And then he says you can maximize performance simultaneously, spend more time in that length position. Again, those won't always intersect. Spending time in length position is almost certainly a good idea. Instead of spending in the usually less hypertrophic shortened position, or does it just depend on which tempo gives you the best SFR? So I'll say SFR goes above and beyond everything. So if in theory, stretching causes more growth, but it doesn't give you a big pump of big DOMs, something else you're doing causes an insane amount of disruption, I'd probably go with that disruption, because a lot of biomechanical theory is very hard to implement and has 10 counter examples to it. Like, well, ideally the joint would be like this. Well, you didn't count for the moment of the triceps from this other angle. Biomechanics in real life is ultra complicated. There's a cheat sheet. How are the muscles actually responding? Like if your tricep is getting blown up like crazy, like super pumps, insane DOMs, insane mind muscle, and it's been growing steadily, I'm never going to tell you what you're doing is wrong. I don't give a fuck what the biomechanics say. That's something an insane person would say you have to worry about. So definitely SFR, but you'll notice that a lot of times your SFR for movements in which you pause the rows, you get a pretty baller stimulus in the mid back, the muscles that actually do this, but your lats might not get the best stimulus because you're like, the bottom stretch is just not that challenging anymore. And I'm not getting as big of a lat pump, whereas I would get a bigger lat pump if I was going all the way down with heavy weight and just touching at the top. So SFR is muscle specific at that point. So you got to think, what is my target here? Is it overall back development? Is it my rhomboids and mid traps that really are challenged at the top? Or is it the whole back, which is challenged mostly through length of position? And then he says, you've also stated previously, doing isometrics is some exercise along with concentrics and eccentric might overall stimulate better hypertrophy, since there are 3 of them independent pathways. Yep. For signaling hypertrophy. Yep. Would love to hear you guys clear my confusion and break this down. So my best breaking down is just follow SFR and understand that unless the SFRs are really good for paused rows, there's no magical reason to do them. And that, remember, isometric contractions also count when you pause at the bottom for a stretch. So you don't have to just pause at the top to get the isometric checkbox. So I would say SFR is king all the time. And if a movement doesn't give you better SFR, but requires you to use less weight and spend less time in the shortened position, less time in the lengthened position, more time in the shortened, and it doesn't increase your SFR, it's probably not a good idea to include a lot, or it should at least be second guessed, right? James?
Really great answer, Mike. And I feel like you're going to relate to my point very well here, but something that I have noticed, I think the people who dive into the biomechanics stuff more often than not just get total paralysis by analysis. And it's not to dismiss biomechanics because it's a really awesome and useful field that does so many great things. But in the world of hypertrophy training specifically, and I would even say in sport training, this is one of those things where like once you go into these rabbit holes of like all these different vectors and trying to do all these like weird, very minute movement things, you can't see the forest for the trees, right? At some point, you just have to go in there and do some reasonable training. And that's why we say SFR just like tosses all of this shit away. The person that drives me the most crazy are the, I'm going to make a lot of enemies here, but I'm going to try and do it in a nice way. People who study physical therapy, who want to be strength conditioning coaches and just biomech the living shit out of everything and propose those ideas as being like really good strength conditioning practices. Really, those are practices of like how to not hurt and do like minimalist training. The SFR really just wipes all this stuff away. And I'm not trying to dismiss biomechanics, but what I am saying is most people who go down these rabbit holes start getting into such minutia little details. Like Mike was saying, like at some point, like you can fuck around with your bent row technique till you're blue in the face, but some other guy who has just been adding sets, adding RIR, making it more challenging week to week through increases in intensity and, RIR, that person's going to blow you out of the water in 10 weeks because you're sitting there fucking with elbow this, elbow that, elbow here, pause there, pause at this point. Get the fuck out of here. It's not to say that you shouldn't train intelligently, but I think this is one of those where you go down this rabbit hole and there's nowhere to go outside of just doing like reasonable training. It always comes back to the same thing. And that's why SFR is so helpful.
James, I want to write that down because I was meaning to make a video about it anyway for YouTube, and I'll make a whole video.
And like, not to belabor this, but my point has always been like, are you training to get better at something or are you training to not get injured? Those are two different things. And the biomech people typically fall into the like, either complete novelty realm or training not to get injured realm. And they just completely deviate from the, are you trying to get better at something, the specificity realm, right? Which is where Mike and I live. Like, what do you want? Do you want to be a great rugby player? Do you want to be jacked? Like, okay, now we have some constraints on the training. Whereas these, like a lot of the people who go into this biomech stuff is just like, it devolves into kind of like academic, intellectual wankery about like different positions, different force curves, different angles. Like, I hear you, but why don't you go fucking train, homie? Come back, tell me how it went.
So brilliant stuff, James. I'm actually going to be doing a video on this sooner than later because it's very pressing, especially in the state of the industry right now. The way I see it is this: biomechanics should be the first place you go to try to develop exercise technique. You don't have to anymore because there's exercises on the internet you can try, but which one to pick is just based on biomech. Like, okay, the quads extend the knee, so any extension of the knee is going to be good. And the adductors do this and that, so maybe that'll be Lane's leg press. Okay, your biomech was the first guess,
and that's then like such a superficial level.
Such
of biomech,
it should be
right?
obvious,
it's just like scratching the surface of biomech.
Right, and I mean maybe like more in nuance, like how do I hit the lats a little bit more with grip position, with turning my hands, maybe some nuance is fine, but not a ton is the first guess. Then you take whatever biomech says, hey, this is probably the way you should move. Probably you take it, you do it in real life, and you assess SFRs. And you change positioning and change the technique to see which one has the best SFRs. And some of that could be like, well, which changes should I make? Could be hints could emerge from a second pass biomechanically. Okay, really zoom in. Where does the humerus really connect here? Okay, well, I think that means the pec would do this. All right, then we try that. In every one of those cases, biomech is the first informer. SFR is the final adjudicator. SFR is fucking king. If you're not getting pumped or sore, or some shit's not happening to your tricep, I don't give a fuck what biomech that guy says. Technically, it's activating your long head. My long head's not pumped, motherfucker. It's not tired. It doesn't get sore. I haven't been seeing size improvements. Go fuck yourself. So at the end of the day, SFR is the king. Biomech, I'll tell you this, and this is like the ghost of Jared Feather talking through me. It doesn't take a lot of biomech to figure out how to do shit remotely right. And SFR, just following the SFR snake, gets you the rest of the way anyway. You'll be able to intuit, like if I put my legs this way and this way, my quads feel more or less stimulated, my knees feel more or less better. They don't even need biomechanics for that. That's just trial and error. Biomechanics is like dropping you into a neighborhood as a paratrooper. You got to do the rest by yourself. Like reassessing where you were dropped. It's like, yeah, this neighborhood, now it's all you. SFR is your guidance to the street with your little GPS thing. Like a lot of guys get it backwards and say, well, biomechanical, this should be the best exercise for your lats. Like, I've done it, it sucks. And they're like, well, it can't suck. Biomechanics never lies. Like, your assessment of biomechanics is not what's happening in the body. And if we look at it, be like, oh, I guess the teres major was compensating. I didn't think of that. Yeah, you did. You know how complex that systems problem is in biomechanics? It's outside the realm of currently any computer to be able to do. There is no fully integrated human model of muscle mechanics and bone mechanics. As soon as they make that, they'll be able to make a robot that walks just as fluid as a human. That problem is just now starting to be solved. I assure you, it's an insanely complex problem. You won't be able to first principles your way into guaranteeing this is going to hit the lat exactly how you want. You won't be able to do it. You'll be able to first principles biomechanics your way into having a good guess, and then it's SFR at the end of the road.
And like kind of like what you're saying, like, does it pass sanity checks in the real world? Because you can do intellectual wankery all you want, but it's like, okay, well, this should work, and you do it, and you're like, well, this didn't work at all. Now what? Now what do you do?
Now what? So, all right. Next up is, I think it's Say Han Bang.
Sweet name.
Which is either a sweet Korean name or somebody fucking around.
I hope it's Si Han Bang.
Si Han Bang.
Because then it's like Si Han Bang, Si Han come.
Sweet.
Si Han take a nap afterwards.
Yeah. Cigarette, sandwich, nap, in that order. All right. Sehan says, hey docs, is it reasonable to count sets separately for different parts of your back, for your lats, mid-back, traps? If so, what would be the average MEV MRV range be? Would it be smaller than when you count sets for your back in a more general sense? Thanks. So a few things. It would be smaller than sets for your general back in almost every case. What would the MEV MRV range? You'd have to figure that out yourself. I have no fucking clue. It would be so different for people and such a minute separation of the back. This answers some combination of impossible to find out / uninteresting to me in its entirety. You know what I mean? Like, Jesus Christ, you can find this out yourself, no problem. Just training. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then, so yes, it can be done. Now, I warn you about the following. You could get into a wormhole of most of the exercises you choose will be affecting more than one of these at a time. First of all. Secondly, how are you going to count that volume? And then you can get into fractional set counting and other bits of insanity. James and I would probably just tell you to do this. Are you getting hit in all the areas of your back that you want to be? Like stimulated thoroughly? Is it pushing close to recovery? Like, are your erectors getting sore? Do they take long enough to cover that? By the next time you train erectors, they're just barely recovered. If that's not the case, do more exercises, more sets of those with more erector volume. And you can auto-regulate that to fill all the gaps. Like, it's not rocket science. You don't need to count anything. You'd be like, all right, I did 5 sets of rows, which I know hit my erectors a lot. I did 5 sets of pull-ups, which I know hit my lats a lot as well, but not my erectors. And it looks like my lats are getting really fried, but my erectors need more work. What do I need to do? Well, pick another exercise to add into the mix, or just do more sets of rows until your erectors have had enough. And then maybe because your rows also hit your lats, you increase the amount of rowing to 6 sets and decrease the amount of vertical pulling to 4. Now your lats are just as fried as ever, just more of it comes from rowing, less from vertical pull. And in addition, your erectors are good to go. It's really just, it all happens so much more seamlessly if you look at it from a, what am I feeling? How fast am I recovering in the areas of the back perspective? Versus even the more formal counting perspective of, you have to start counting fractional sets. Jesus Christ. If you want to do that sort of thing, it's great. But, any small amount of perception, mind muscle awareness is going to get you there way faster. James?
Yeah. And to your point, like, I can only think of 2 exercises off the top of my head, which you are actually truly isolating a part of the back. Lat prayers and shrugs come to mind. That's the only ones I can think of. Everything else is going to be hitting a very large portion of your back. And Mike has talked about this for years and years and years. That's why it's a good idea to have kind of an emphasis portion of your back training where you might have kind of like a lat emphasized day and a, mid back or row emphasized day, because it makes tracking all this nonsense a lot easier. So you know that for your lat emphasis day, like, maybe I'm not counting, fractional sets or anything like that, but I know I need like 8 sets to kind of get a good workout that day. And on my row day, it's more like 5 or 6 sets, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is, but you know that they're a little bit different, and you can't completely separate them out. It's just not worth the fuss.
Yeah, and that's why we say most back sessions or most back training attempts should be a lot of compound vertical pulling, a lot of compound rowing, and the kinds of vertical pulling, kinds of rowing you pick, and also the kinds of lat prayers and or things like flexion rows, peak hold rows, that kind of stuff you sprinkle in as needed to fill out the rest of whatever it is you're not getting. It's almost like you put a big old turkey leg on your plate and a big old thing of rice. That's vertical pulls and rows. And do you want some chips with that? Do you want some fruit with that? Do you want some juice with that? That's easy to fill in, but you don't make a meal without a big ass turkey leg and a fucking big thing of rice. Like that has to be there. And if it's not there, and you try to fruit cup your way into making a regular meal, like, well, I'm gonna do 1 set of this for this part of the back, 1 set of that for that part of the back. First of all, your enjoyment of training is going straight to fucking hell. Second of all, the compound overhead vertical work and compound rowing that you're going to be doing is so high in raw stimulus magnitude. It's the easiest one-shot kill ever. It's that the analogy of doing squats and leg presses for your quads versus just leg extensions and just the adductor machine. Like, there's something missing there, man. You don't want to train like that.
Yeah.
Which is funny because Doug Bergnoli says you got to train everything in isolation. And, like, that's his big thing. He had a debate.
Yeah. I mean,
good luck getting actually jacked. I don't know.
This, again, it's like one of those intellectual wankery things where it's like, does that theoretically make sense? Like, can you make equally good gains? Like, yeah, maybe. But then when you actually look at the real world, how people actually train, it's like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
Or may not really have.
There's something missing there. There's something, there's more, there's a missing piece between that theory and what happens in reality.
Yeah. Like, you could do a few sets of squats, or you could worry about, okay, I need quads, I need adductor magnus, adductor brevis, I need sartorius, I need all these. You're going to do an exercise for all that shit? Get the fuck out of here. Like, no, you're not. Just a medium stance squat hits almost your entire leg minus your hamstrings. Like, now we're rolling. Now we're fucking rolling. And a huge raw stimulus magnitude too.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is actually, like, more often than not, doing things in a compound fashion just allows you to get a bigger raw stimulus magnitude, bigger than the sum of the individual parts.
Yes.
In most cases. So,
yes. It's like, how many leg extensions? That's what I need to do to get what 4 squats that's get me. And it's like, there may be no answer to that question. Maybe you would fatigue way before you could even provide that level of stimulus. Or the level of stimulus would be like, well, 8 sets. Like, fuck that. 8 sets of leg extensions, plus I have to do all my adductor work, all my sartorius work. Like, what? Fuck that. Like, wait, so what do I actually do? Like, well, just 5 sets of squats will get all that. You're like, well, Jesus Christ, count me in, and more reliably stimulated too. So.
And sorry, this is we're going off on a tangent on this one, but I can imagine that when you train everything in isolation, you're more likely to have kind of a weakest link problem, where at some point, like, you've done so much like gracilis training that you just can't really move anymore. You know what I mean? Where it's just like, I actually, my legs hurt so badly at this point, like, I can't do anything else.
Yeah.
And that becomes a limiting factor to your training, right? Versus doing something like a squat.
For sure. All right, next up and last is Clark Kant.
Kant.
Yep. So simultaneously, Superman's given Earth name and Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, blended together. Perfect fodder for our European proto-fascist incel joke. Well, Immanuel Kant really have a lot of good ideas, and we should look at them. So maybe that's what's going on. And wouldn't it be funny if he was Superman? Anyway, all right. Clark Kant says, hi docs, I have a question about EMG data. Many popular fitness articles, in many popular fitness articles, EMG data is used as a measure of how much an exercise stimulates a given muscle group. The higher the activation, the more muscle is worked. However, no precise definition is ever given of what working muscle more means. Don't worry, that's because they don't know it. Many lay readers seem to translate what is said into informal notion of RSM. The higher the activation shown, the higher the RSM of an exercise. This seems to be untrue, as say tricep kickbacks have way higher tricep activation than close grip bench, but it is evident to many that the RSM of an appropriately loaded close grip bench is much higher. Same idea in hamstring curls versus stiff-legged deadlifts. Stiff-legged deadlifts have lower EMG profile on average. There's one head of the hamstrings in which that's not the case, but mostly it's the average is way lower. But you say, hey, you can either do 4 sets of leg curls or 4 sets of stiff leg deadlifts for 10. Which one's going to get you more sore? Like, what? I may never walk again after 4 sets of 10 stiff legged deadlifts. Like, right. Like in the pump and the burn, it's just nonsense. And I look at power lifters that do lots of stiff legged deadlifts and their hamstrings have like watching Ben Pollock do stiff legged deadlifts in real life. I was like, motherfucker, you got 8 hamstrings. What the fuck is going on back there? He had up to that point in his life, maybe done like 10 leg curls total. Like, how the fuck is their hamstrings that big? Like, well, gee whiz, I think this actually works. So then he finishes off and says, it seems to be untrue. Oh, sorry. Close grip bench versus tricep kickbacks, but it's evident to many that the RSM of appropriately loaded close grip bench is much higher. So what does EMG data tell us? How do we use it to inform our exercise selection? As always, thank you for the informative content. So EMG is just a real big part of the picture. Real small part of a big picture. And the EMG tells you what muscle parts of the muscle are generally going to be active. Active is not the same thing as stimulating. A muscle's activity eventually ends up stimulating by, in the proper ways, generating tension and exposing the muscle to other forms of tension, which is called passive tension. So EMG proxies active tension decently well, though not perfectly. It doesn't proxy passive tension very well at all. For example, the lunge exercise, the EMG crushes it in glute flexion at the very top. Like if you do a hip thrust at the very top, EMG for glutes is super high. In the lunge exercise, the EMG for glutes is never really as high as you would think, except lunges fuck up your glutes more on a how much damage they do per set basis. And also some of the data showing that lunges are probably at least as hypertrophic as glute bridges and maybe set for set even more so. And this is something like you do glute bridges for the first time, you might get a little bit of peripheral glute soreness. You do lunges the first time, you're not walking for a few days, your ass is on fire 100% of the time. That's got to tell us the RSM for lunges is higher. Like it almost certainly is. One of the things is EMG has many problems as a measurement tool. And it's only ever meant to be a super general measurement tool. And it's meant to tell you muscle activity is active activity in the motor unit sampled when you put the EMG leads onto where you want to put them. There's tons of crossover. There's tons of all kinds of noise. And the EMG ends up being, the EMG answers questions for you that you may not be able to intuit just from RSM stuff like that, stimulus proxies. Maybe you could intuit them, but you just want a good guess. So for example, there's EMG data on does closer stance work or wider stance work seem to activate the glutes more? The answer is, based on most of the EMG studies, wider stance targets the glutes better. But that's not good enough to just go and be like, okay, wide stance, everything. You have to confirm that with when you do wide stance, squatting and sumo stuff. Are your glutes getting pumped? Are they getting sore? Do they feel like they're really getting tired? Because if not, the EMG is a hint at what's going on, but it's not a holistic hint whatsoever. And especially the EMG can't detect stretch under load, mediated hypertrophy and things like that. So like tricep kickbacks at the very top, your triceps are fully active doing this. Of course, the EMG is going to be really high, but this part of the skull crusher or whatever is what actually grows your triceps the most. And the EMG generally tends to stay pretty like, yeah, there's activity, but it's nothing to write home about. It ignores all that passive tension. And then, that you're left with seeing EMG stuff that's very discordant. So EMG is not the same as RSM, but robust EMG data showing this is really what's active is a hint, just like biomechanics to us, that maybe there's going to be high raw stimulus magnitude doing this kind of movement or position. And if it doesn't turn out to be that way, then we know the EMG data was limited. James?
Really good. Couple other things about EMG that are worth noting. So it's really only kind of giving you an indication of the surface level electrical activity going on at that given site, wherever they put it on there. So there's a lot of potential for user error, crossover effects, like Mike already said. But one thing that I have found to be very notable with EMG is that different conditions and different users are a huge confounder. So one thing you'll find with EMG is you could have, just as an example, if you have somebody do a barbell squat with 2 feet on the floor in a very just normal position, you can measure the EMG, right? And then you have them do a barbell squat on Bosu balls and do the same measurement. What you'll actually find is that their quad activity went up according to the EMG. Why is that? Well, it's because there's just more activity of the quad during that unstable task. Well, why is that? Well, it's because you're actually having to stabilize yourself the whole time. So you're getting a constant like negative and positive feedback loops going, trying to hold you in the proper position. Is that force actually being used to summate big forces to do the muscle action that you're trying to do in the squat? No, it's being used for stabilization task. Another thing, when you look at like the tricep kickback, for example, I don't know about you, Mike, but everyone I've ever tried to do tricep kickbacks with is awkward as fuck the first couple times unless you've been doing it for a while. Whereas like a close grip bench, most people can kind of figure out or have done before reasonably. So you kind of get into the same problem where if you're measuring an activity that is awkward for somebody or their technique's not very good, you're going to get a lot of muscle activation just as a result of it being an uncoordinated movement. So for them, it's like, I don't really know what I'm doing. So you're going to see tons and tons and tons of muscle activity versus when you actually are really well trained at a movement. Very often you'll actually see a huge consolidation of the actual muscles used to do the movement because your technique has become so smooth and efficient at it. So very often you can actually see some of these kind of weird errors where you're using like a unstable condition or a novel exercise or an exercise that somebody's just kind of awkward at, where you can see these like disproportionately high EMG activities, even though, again, in the real world, it doesn't seem to add up. So in my personal opinion, I've only seen one or two EMG studies that I thought actually made sense and were worthwhile. And then I've never bothered looking at EMG again. And that was one where they compared different calf exercises under straight knee and bent knee conditions. That was really the only one where I was like, yep, that was actually helpful. Thank you very much. All other EMG
and the biomechanics supports it because the flexed gastrocnemius is like passively insufficient and then right? We didn't really need EMG to tell us that, but like that calf EMG and that calf biomechanics lead to the same suggestion as like, okay, yeah, maybe you can try some bent calf raises and also realize something's getting pumped, but it's not the main meat and belly of my calf. Like, okay, well, that's all the three things we need.
I remember when I was doing my dissertation. So for those of you who don't know, I did a whole bunch of sled pushing stuff. And I think, I don't want to stroke my own ego here too much. I think I was one of the first people to do sled push research. Just a little wank for myself right there. But I remember people were trying to get me to do EMG for it. And I was like, guys, have you pushed the sled? We all know what's going on here. Like, right?
Also, yeah.
Not only that, but it was just like, we're doing knee extension and hip extension. It's the same shit, different day. Like, we don't need to go push the sled and tell me what muscles you feel. We're good. We got it. We don't need EMG to do this.
Let me finish this off by reading something directly from PubMed, which is unusual. Okay.
Oh.
So here is the article. It is titled it's published by A.L. Hoff, which is really funny. Little maybe a cousin of James's. So it says it's titled "The Relationship Between Electromyogram and Muscle Force." It was published as long ago. This is why this stuff is not new to us. It's published in 1997. Okay. Some guidelines this is the abstract. Some guidelines are given for interpretation of the electromyogram. In static isometric contractions, there is usually a linear relationship between muscle force and smooth rectified EMG, which is a smooth rectified EMG is SRE. That's the kind of EMG stuff you see reported in the literature for the most part, especially when regular coaches are talking about it. It's always smooth and rectified, because otherwise, if it's not smooth and rectified, it looks like pure nonsense.
And it's in isometric conditions, which are much easier to deal with.
So here's the beginning. It should be considered, however, that most of the time, several muscles are active simultaneously around a joint. That they include several muscle heads, by the way. This finding implies that the relationship between SRE of a single muscle and joint total moment needs not be linear. During movements, the force, length, velocity relationship, and the elastic properties of muscle should be taken into account. That can change things in a huge way. Also, EMGs during concentric movements are larger than those measured during isometric actions. And we have literature since then to show that eccentric EMGs are also not as profound. But remember, the eccentric contraction forms at least 50% of the impetus for muscle growth, possibly more, probably more, maybe like 60 or something. So if what EMG tells you really well is, in a concentric movement, is that muscle really active? Yeah. Is it producing plenty of force? Yes. It's not showing you it's producing maximal force. It's not showing you that most of the muscle is being recruited. And in isometric and eccentric actions, you could have very, very different stuff. So how does the lunge fuck you up? Well, the eccentric loading of the glute in the front leg as you go down, that's the big ticket for lunges. That's what grows your glute so much. That is entirely almost missing from peak EMG stuff. And you would say, oh, the lunge isn't that great. Where do we see, in the hip thrust, that's a small, short range concentric contraction. Of course, we're going to see great EMG data, but that might not tell us everything we need to know. So again, a lot of that stuff specifically eccentric stuff, specifically longer muscle lengths, specifically with passive tension. That stuff the EMG either purposefully picks up poor or doesn't pick up at all. And then we have a situation where the EMG, again, gives us these general overall hints that aren't so super useful. So if someone says, well, EMG data shows that XYZ is better exercise for your tricep than this other exercise, try them both, see what your stimulus to fatigue ratio is, see what your raw stimulus magnitude is like on the proxies. If one of them just fucks you up completely and the other one's like, meh, then you know the right one. The tricep kickback, everyone's done it. It's a dog shit exercise. You have to use an infinity amount of them to get remotely sore. You can barely get a pump. It kind of hurts your elbow a little bit. It feels fucking weird.
Posture's wonky. Like,
oh my God, it's harder to hold your shoulder up than it is to do the extension itself. That's like the isometric insufficiency. Like it's harder to do this than it is to do this. So you might as well drop it down and do this with a cable. So tricep kickback stuff for all those, great. It's great EMG, but you can clearly tell if you do that versus a skull crusher, which one is staying, which one's leaving.
Yeah, absolutely. And fun fact, guys, they also do an intrafusal EMG. Most of the EMG studies you look at will just be surface electrodes, but they actually do have a fancy one where they actually stick a wire into the muscle fiber itself, which is kind of fucked up and weird. Also, I was just thinking about that study where they were looking at the glute activation with the hip thrusts. Like those the PI in that lab, the audacity, pull your pants down so I can put these EMG electrodes on your butt cheeks. You fucking
I love it.
You fucking pervert. We all know what was going on here.
Go get that shit, man. Use science to see some ass. That's my vote.
Touch some ass. Pervy shit.
I love it. All right. That's all we got.
All right, folks. Thank you so much for your questions. I am working on the RP Secret project, which is shaving years off of my life. I'm also working on editing my book. My buddy Steve is brutalizing me with his edits. So I'm just getting fucked left and right on all these projects. So I'm not feeling my best, but things are moving along. Dr. Mike, what do you got going on?
Everything's secret. I got to shut up a lot. So
then shut up.
Then shut up.
What are you doing? God. YouTube channel's going good. Thanks for got some positive feedback on my training video. By the way, some of you were hating on my tank top. That tank top was meant to be a joke. Did you notice that it says I heart Margs on it? And I also got it for free at my local liquor store. It was in a basket.
Oh, amazing.
Free tank tops. I was like, this is like a women's medium. I'm like, I'm taking it.
Some of the incels got very upset at the tank top.
I know. I was like, I'm not wearing it to look more buff. I thought it was funny because it's a stupid tank top. Whatever.
Remember, no one would ever tell you that in real life to your face. Hide behind that screen. I love it.
Yeah. That's it for this Q&A, guys. Thanks for joining us. Make sure you subscribe. There's all sorts of fun videos in the works. There's always good training videos, good Dr. Mike videos, and we will see you next time.